Professor Palmer. Thank you, Mohammed, and greetings to you. It's 9:30 in Chapel Hill. And I was telling both Mohammed and David that I was really impressed by the description of the project and its insights, its brilliance in some ways. And so in what I will try to do is that I will make a case that from 1857 and to 1940s, British Empire was instrumental in creating the infrastructure for Muslim connectivity. And there is a close connection between the idea of the Muslim world and Ummah in modern times, and also Muslim modernism and the way Islamic civilization and Islam as a religion defined, and the experience of Muslims under British Empire, but also by under other empires. And we often overlook the significance of the British imperial experience for modern Muslim thought and modern Muslim identities because of a mistaken identity, mistaken historical narrative, which was built in the late 19th century, that there was an Islamic world united, but the Europeans came and divided this Islamic world. And I will try to make the case that Muslim societies were always divided among empires, different empires, and British unintentionally united them, unintentionally, I will say. It wasn't their intention, but in some ways, by the late 19th century, by the 1920s, actually, British Empire was ruling half of world's Muslims in Asia. And they had this claim to be the greatest Muslim empire in the world, the greatest Mohammedan empire, that Churchill and many other figures were talking about it. And it was partly a rhetoric, but it was also something beyond the rhetoric, that there was also an invisible part of the Muslim experience during this period of almost 100 years where British Crown ruled majority of the Muslim societies in terms of how we define Islam as a world religion, as a civilization, and in terms of our current definitions of geopolitics of today. So in my book, I began to argue that the Islamic world, the idea of the Muslim world, was co-constituted by this experience. It wasn't preceding European imperialism. Today, I will go into more details, and I had in my mind, of course, your other interest here is the Chinese attempt to create a Roads and Belts initiative. And I was going to say that Britain, without naming it that way, in fact, was building this kind of steam and print initiative in Asia that created the Muslim connectivity. And we want to think about the kind of implications of that imperial grid, imperial infrastructure for what it means to be Muslim. And that changes, right? I will argue that the way modern Muslims think about their religion, their history, is actually formed in the late 19th century. It wasn't inherited from early Islam, or it was reinterpreted in the late 19th century. And that the British imperial context was very important for that story. So let me have my PowerPoint to tell this story. So I will share a couple of pictures. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, but this description of the broader research project is simply brilliant. Is in terms of that would be the main argument. There are interconnections between religion, infrastructure, and empire in Eurasia. And in this case, my focus is on Muslim religion, although I could have talked about Buddhism, Hinduism as well. Infrastructure of steamships, trains, steam, basically trains and mostly ships, but also telegraph, cheap printing. And empire is the most important aspect of it, is that empire involved mainly British Empire, but its relationship with the Ottoman Empire, its rivalry with the Russian and the Dutch Empire. But what I will highlight is that there are legacies for today that we have to seriously consider. So the story that I will tell you has a lot to do with this woman. And here she is with her Muslim, she never called her servant. His name is Abdul Karim. In the last 10 years of her life, he was Queen Victoria's teacher of Urdu. But she was also, showing him off to indicate that she was the queen of Muslims in India, but other places as well. And this geography at the time when Abdul Karim was with Queen Victoria, and there's even a dramatic movie that you can watch where Judi Dench's Queen Victoria, it's called Victoria and Abdul, where they make them, they're trying to show how great she was in terms of being inclusive and cosmopolitan, but then you can also see the other dark racist side of the British Empire. But the reality that I will tell you is that for about 90 to 100 years, this red geography was ruled by British Empire, the Indian Ocean Zone. And these are areas that hosted majority of Muslims in the world. Even today, more Muslims live on the Indian Ocean part to the east of Mecca. And that is, if you combine India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Muslims in Burma, which were part of the British India at that time, they will probably make more than 500 million Muslims today. But you also have to include Malay, Southeast Asia. Dutch Indonesia were connected to this network through Singapore shipping. Then British ruled Nigeria, Sudan, Egypt. Then after World War I, and even before Yemen, Palestine, Iraq, Jordan. So this is a very large area. I think the claim to be the greatest Muslim empire relies on this fact. But more important is that 1857 to 1900 is when British Empire built an infrastructure of steamships, which made travel between within Asia, but also between Asia and Europe much faster and safer, which then increased Muslim connectivity, the Muslim travel between different parts of Asia and Arabia. The pilgrimage increased almost 10 times. The number of pilgrims increased almost 10 times during this period. And I will tell you more about this. But there is more to this story that, of course, related to, on the one hand, British Empire allowing Muslim empowerment and connectivity, travel and speed. But on the other hand, giving them a certain sense of a certain level of problems, a set of problems related to discrimination, second-class status, racialization, and that's this tension between what we call the imperial Islamophobia and the empowerment of Muslims within empire is the topic of this talk. It's also related to today's issues and problems in Chinese Rosen Belt Initiative. So this map on the right is a replica of the map of the Middle East drawn by Alfred Mahan, great American geopolitical thinker. And he made this map around 1900, and he was indicating this red zone as the Middle East, but you can see how Middle East, Arabia, is actually an extension of Indian Ocean, or certain parts of Indian Arabia, Hijaz, Oman, Yemen, is not just part of the Middle East, but is part of India too. And I think that's the story that will become very important. I will show you another map to indicate the claim to be the greatest Mohammedan empire by the British. And this is a map by Alfred Zweimer, is an American Protestant missionary who built Hartford Seminary's program in Muslim World Studies, and also built the Muslim journal, journal named Muslim World. I have an article on this. So in 1894, when he made this map, he made this map of green colored Islamic world, which was a very new idea. So this is not the imagination of a traditional concept of a Muslim community. And then as we pay attention in India, he's kind of hesitant that in the north he made this green to indicate the Muslim majority there. But if you look at the details on who is ruling over Muslims, you can see that the Great Britain ranks number 1. He exaggerates the number of Muslims in China as number 2, Dutch number 3, France number 4, Russia 5, and an independent Muslim dynasty, which has a non-Muslim population of Armenians and Greek Turkey, ranks as number 5. And I think we overlook and forget that reality in the late 19th century. I did indicate that these type of maps were unthinkable before the 19th century because Muslims were always part of different empires. These empires were diverse and cosmopolitan. If you look at the history of empires like China and Mughal Empire, for example, Mughal Empire was ruled by a Muslim dynasty, but the majority Hindus. These are empires in history, and you can't really create a map of a religiously defined geopolitics, religiously defined borders. And I think this is a very modern attitude. And it has also have something to do with race. And this is another map that was done at the end of the period that I will discuss. It's a map by Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against Worldwide White Supremacy in 1924. The map is from that book. Actually, the book and Stoddard is a figure in The Great Gatsby, both in the book and the movie. If you watch the movie, they talk about this professor who is a Harvard PhD, who was also very racist, but he was a thinker about race, and he actually created this brown race between yellow race and black race and white race. And if you look at the brown race, it's basically Muslims and Hindus before they are being partitioned. And this majority of this brown Muslim and Hindu race was ruled by the British. Now, so what? I will say, yes, that experience of being ruled by the British mattered in terms of what it means to be Muslim. And this is how my story starts, is that before 1857, British East India Company was ruling over different Muslim populations in an indirect way. Maybe I will start the story with the 1857 Muslim rebellion, Muslim and Hindu rebellion against Britain, is suppression. But after the rebellion, British Queen is declaring some sort of freedom of religion and a kind of imperial secularism with some sort of a Islamophobic fear of Muslims, saying that British Empire will respect religious freedom and diversity. This is the proclamation. So even though Britain will rule over their religion, their politics, they're free in their religion, which then made Queen Victoria also an empress of India in 1878. So what? Here's the issue, is that large Muslim populations in India then began to accept the reality of the British Empire and their rights, their positions there. And since they were all ruled by different empires, in a way, it's not unusual that you want to improve your rights and conditions within the British Empire, ask the best of it to gain equality, and not to think of the British Empire as a place where there's a kind of clash between Islam and Christianity from the Muslim perspective. But I want to introduce one technological story, the development, then I will get back to the British Empire in over Muslim societies in Indian Ocean. The greatest infrastructure investment of that period was partly financed by Britain. It was also financed by France, and it's the Suez Canal construction, completed in 1869. It was done in Egypt. Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, although it was in a kind of autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire. It was opened with a great ceremony in 1869, where they composed an opera to celebrate it. Most of the guests were from Europe. And during the ceremony, the great ceremony, that actually shortened the travel between Europe and Indian Ocean, India, from 2 months to 2 weeks. The governor of Egypt at that time, Khedive Ismail, said, with this Canal, Egypt became part of Europe. And he meant, it's in an ironic way, the Ottoman Empire was already part of the European diplomatic club. He meant it will make Egypt closer to Europe. But the opposite will happen in the next following 50 years, that Egypt will become more African, more Asian, and although it's also become more Muslim because of its connectivity through the canal to Indian Ocean and the Muslims in the Indian Ocean under British Empire. And I think that's the contradictions of the late 19th century imperial world, where the globalization, and it's part of the description of this project, also brought re-regionalization, that you assume that with globalization of Egypt will become part of and it did become part of the international order centered in Europe, but it also became more racialized, more regionalized, became more African and more Muslim in that process. So what is the infrastructure part? Is that while this is happening, steamship travel speeded the links in different societies. And this is a fascinating map of like each color showing how long it takes to travel, a week or 2 weeks. I think it's not a perfect map, but I'm gonna share this thing with you. I also wanna pay attention to telegraph networks that sends news from one place to another very efficient way, very quickly. And this is important for imperial administration, but it's also important for cheap printing. So if you are a Muslim newspaper or journal or a book publisher in India, you get news from Istanbul or Egypt very quickly within a day or two. And in that sense, you can imagine to be part of Asia, to be part of broader Muslim societies synchronously, that you can get the news quickly and immediately, which will become very important for kind of a broader geopolitical Muslim as well as Buddhist and Asian identities at that time. Just to say, to briefly, this is well known, but I want to highlight how ambivalent that opening of the Suez Canal was. That the initial Statue of Liberty was supposed to be at the entrance of the canal. Was supposed to be an Egyptian woman holding the torch. And it was saying that Egypt is linking or bringing the light of Europe to Asia, but it wasn't funded. So I think the architect then redid this to make it the Statue of Liberty that we know in New York. But it does show kind of Egypt's ambivalent position at that time as kind of African, Asian, and European, and it's intersection of all three. So what is happening under British rule is that, let me talk about in terms of the excitement and empowerment of the Muslims. And I don't mean to diminish the imperial oppression and racism, but let's talk about pilgrimage, for example, that the steamships, some of which was run by the British company like Thomas Cook and Son, which made that company very relevant, was carrying pilgrims much safely and much cheaper from India to Mecca, which was then creating a boom of religious excitement, because suddenly the number of pilgrims to Mecca from India increased from several thousand to 50, 60, 70,000. And the number of pilgrims actually moved from, because of this technological infrastructure and the grid, moved from 10 at the beginning of the 19th century to 100 at the end of the 19th century. And this tenfold increase, of course, brought a lot of administrative problems of providing sanitation and transportation, and created the cholera epidemic, and probably responsible for the birth of the World Health Organization, because of one of the first international inter-imperial meetings on health and epidemic was done to deal with the cholera epidemic around Mecca. And I think there was one big crisis in the 1860s where about 20 to 30,000 pilgrims out of 100 died from cholera, which then led to the institution of quarantine stations, and regulation of the pilgrimage. One aspect of this pilgrimage is that from the British perspective, pilgrimage is an interesting way to show that they're nice to Muslims. They encourage their religious obligation. It's something about British imperial secularism. Look how good we are. We're carrying to pilgrimage, making money, but they're also being very tolerant of poor Muslim pilgrims who are going to pilgrimage with one-way ticket. Pilgrimage before the steamships was an upper-class phenomenon. The only wealthy can do this long trip, and some of them were also trading. But only after the steamships, as you can see, one ticket here at the bottom, Cook's and Son Mecca pilgrimage ticket. Some of the Indian authorities actually allowed pilgrims to go there without a return ticket, which made it the poor Muslims going to pilgrimage, and then becoming really destitute after they complete the pilgrimage because they cannot come back, and they will end up in British consulate in Jeddah asking help to return to India, which actually British consulate did help them to return. So from kind of a British perspective, it's a great management of religious sites, religious travel, also caring about disease and quarantine. But from a Muslim perspective, it is, technology is basically making religious obligations easier. In some ways, pilgrimage to Mecca became more popular or more doable. In the past, it used to be a great title to be a pilgrim if you're from Indonesia or Philippines or Southeast Asia. But there are more people becoming pilgrim easily. And we have actually some of the great pan-Islamic modernists like Rashid Rida, who did make, not the pilgrimage, but he went to India with British ships, and he would actually comment on how wonderful and how safe they are. And you can see how one religious ritual actually then gaining more significance and became more political because of the infrastructure and technology. From a Muslim perspective, it's interesting is that there's some sort of religious element to this pilgrimage. You can sense a sense of subaltern resistance by using the British technology, British infrastructure, British protection and administration to do your religious ritual. But there is one debate on whether the pilgrimage allowed Muslims to gather to talk about the racism and colonialism and their shared problems. So the British then become paranoid. On the one hand, they're encouraging Muslims to connect. They are providing the infrastructure to connect. But once they're connected, they're also become worried is that if all these Muslims are together in Mecca, what are they talking about? Are they talking about us? Are they imagining to end our rule? In reality, there wasn't much politics. I mean, there's so much talk done about Muslim connectivity through pilgrimage. I checked, it's really not a political space, and people are there to perform a ritual. There were some pan-Islamist figures, but the exaggeration of so-called the twin epidemics of cholera as well as pan-Islamism is exaggerated. And that's, I think, one important aspect of this period is that empires like the British Empire is supposed to rely on knowledge, on secular administration of diverse populations, but they're also very paranoid, and their paranoia is actually make them fear things that didn't even exist. And I think this fear of Muslim revolt, Muslim disloyalty is an irrational Islamophobic British imperial exaggeration. A good example of this is the debate started by this man named William Hunter. His picture is on the left. He's a British colonial officer, as well as an Orientalist. He's an expert on Islam. And he wrote this extraordinary book that led to a debate in 1871 called Are Mohammedans of India can Mohammedans of India be trusted as loyal to the Queen? Something like that. I should have written the title. His argument is this: is that the Muslims in India claim to be loyal to the Queen, which they were indeed. And the man on the right is actually the great Muslim reformist. His name is Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who got the title Sir, who established the Anglo-Mohammedan College, which became the greatest Muslim university, Aligarh University, who is known for his loyalty to the Queen and the British Empire. But Hunter said this, and that's a very interesting Islamophobic paranoia. He said, I read their religious books, legal books. And according to their religious books, I think Muslims are not supposed to be loyal to a Christian ruler, let alone a woman, right? The Queen is there. And Muslims said, you're wrong on both accounts. Our legal system is flexible. In fact, just before he published that book, we have this book published before William Hunter did that. This is by Mohammedan Literary Societies in Calcutta, who argued that British India is actually the land of safety for Muslims. That according to Islamic law, since Muslims have the freedom to practice their religion, they are empowered, they should consider British rule as legitimate. And it's a very ironic thing is that actually the leading Muslim scholars were considering British rule as legitimate, but Hunter was feeling paranoid, thinking that the Muslims shouldn't actually consider this legitimate. And Sayyid Ahmed Khan immediately responded. He was really upset and angry. He says, because Hunter was making this distinction that the Hindus can be trusted because they are loyal, but Muslims shouldn't be trusted. In fact, they were the ones who led the mutiny because of their religion, which it wasn't true. And I want to note here, I think most of us are familiar with this argument by Edward Said on knowledge and power, and through relying on Foucault. So Saidian argument is that the empire need to know through scholarship and Orientalism their subjects, the Muslims and Hindus. So the Orientalism is actually a political project to serve the empire. But in this case, we see that William Hunter's Orientalism, just reading textbook and claiming that the Muslims cannot be loyal to the empire, is actually not serving the British Empire. He thinks he's serving the British Empire, but it's not, because in reality, Muslims are loyal, that they don't have that kind of a disloyalty. However, there is one aspect of this Muslim presence in the British Empire is that in response to missionaries and racial thinkers, Muslims are also defining, to assert their equality, their religion in a new perspective. They are defining Islam in conversation with both Orientalists and Christians. They're also defining Islam as a response to claims of Muslim racial inferiority. And this is done parallel, this is the kind of pan-Islamic modernism, but it's done parallel to Pan-Asianism and Pan-Africanism. And I want to show one example from Pan-Africanist Edward Blyden, who wrote this article in 1876 called Mohammedans and the Negro Race. And he's making this case, almost thinking of Muslims as a racial group, very similar to the Negro race in his mind, and similar to the yellow race and Asian race, but also thinking that the Muslims are a step ahead of the Negro race, that he thinks that the Muslims have all these reformists, they're doing great within the British Empire. And he's a very interesting thinker. He's an extremely well-educated diplomat from Sierra Leone, who also gives very good footnotes. And when we look at the footnotes, we realize that he actually reads Sayyid Ahmed Khan or some of the Muslim reformists in India who write in English, and their refutations of Christian polemics against Muslims. And he seems to be very sympathetic to this kind of global color alliance between Islam, Muslims as a race, a Negro race, and Asians. I think one argument I'm making is this, is that British Empire in some ways had a very symbiotic relationship with the idea of the Islamic world and the Muslim connectivity and empowerment. But in that symbiotic relationship, there were some sort of a divergent debates. One is what I call the liberal Islamophobia, led by Gladstone, William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, who was aware that the Britain ruled more large population, Muslim populations in India and Asia, but who also thought that the Muslims in the north, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, are barbaric. He called them anti-human specimen of humanity because they have Christian subjects and the Christians should not live under a Muslim rule. So he's making this distinction that Christians can rule over Muslims like British does in India. But the Muslims should never rule over Christians like the Ottomans in Bulgaria and Greece. And then Britain has a moral responsibility to support the Bulgarians if they revolt against the Ottomans. Up to that point, Britain had a very opposite argument that the Ottomans were their allies, and his rival, Disraeli, thought that it's Britain's moral responsibility to support the Ottomans ruled by the Caliph in the Crimean War against Russia as they did, because Britain has large Muslim populations that make the Ottomans and the British as geopolitically as natural allies. And I think this divergence is going to be very important from 1880s to 1910s. There is one other figure that I want to introduce. His name is Wilfrid Scaven Blunt. Very fascinating character. He's a friend of Winston Churchill. They have correspondence. He is anti-colonialist on the issue of Egypt. He didn't like Britain invading Egypt in 1882, but he's for the British Empire in Indian Ocean and India. He supported Muslim reformists like Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Rida, Kawakibi. And he has a very interesting seemingly philo-Islamic vision of British Empire, that if Gladstone is Islamophobic, but he seems friendly to Islam. And his argument is this, is that the Europeans are racist towards Muslims, but he meant continental Europeans. They're Islamophobic, they don't like Muslims. He thinks that eventually they will kick the Muslims out of Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire will be demolished. But he thinks that Britain is unique. Britain does not have any fear or animosity towards Muslims because it's the biggest Muslim empire. And he notes that if the Ottoman Empire ends, Muslims will be headless. They wouldn't have a leader. And in that case, then Islam should go back to the authentic, peaceful part of Arabia and India. And then Britain should be their custodian and a protector. So he imagines the British Empire becoming a global empire because it, through the Muslims, who populated areas from Africa to China. So he imagines the kind of a global Islamic world as a tool of British global hegemony. Well, where does this go? And I think I might end for a discussion is that I'm describing a world of Islamic world that is constituted by the British Empire, ruling over half of Britain's world's Muslim populations, empowering these Muslims. We have wealthy Muslim merchants, wealthy Muslim princes. In the late 19th century, whenever there's a project to fund something, nowadays people will go to the rich Arab oil monarchies of Qatar and UAE, but there was no rich Arab oil monarchies in the late 19th century. People will end up going to India, either to find Indian merchants to support the project or Indian Rajas, Muslim Rajas of Hyderabad and Bhopal. So there was a large Muslim loyalty to the Queen and the British Empire. There was an awareness that the British provide the infrastructure. It's a kind of a secular empire, and you could work your rights through the British Empire. But there was one issue, and that's the issue of Islamophobia. And we can see how disturbing this is by looking at the writings of this British Muslim named Abdullah Killiam. His name is William Killiam. He became a Muslim in 1880s. Became a very active person in Liverpool, built a mosque. Then he established a connection with the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Sultan gave him funding. He wrote a lot of books, and I think some of his books on Islam is given by Queen Victoria to Prince and King Edward. And Britain recognized him as an important figure too. And he developed this idea, like other Indian Muslims, of a double loyalty to the British Queen and the Ottoman Sultan as a spiritual head of Muslims, as a kind of a westernized representative of Islam. Because Ottomans were European. I don't want to go into the details about Ottoman part, but then you will also note this irrational Islamophobia that was fracturing the legitimacy of the British Empire. So the British Empire was trying to be legitimate in the eyes of Muslim populations. And his example is fascinating. He said, we Muslims supported British war against Sudanese government, Mehdi government, which is true. Actually, in fact, Sudanese Mehdi revolted only initially actually against Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Britain came to help Egypt and the Ottoman Empire to suppress the Sudanese revolt. And these are one of the very few revolt of Muslims after 1857. So throughout these 100 years, Britain always talked about Wahhabis and Muslim rebels, but there is actually no Muslim revolt. There's none in India after 1857. There were a couple of tribal revolts in the kind of northern frontiers, but nothing, some clashes with Afghanistan. And there's Sudan. These are, over a 90-year period, there were, before World War I, except Ottoman Empire, the Muslim revolt against the Britain are minimal. In the case of Sudan, it's a very famous story that the British won very quickly, very brutally in some ways, because they have the machine guns, they killed the rebels. Killiam has no problem with it. What he has problem with is that at the end of this war, British soldiers took Mehdi out of his gravesite, mutilated his body and throw it into Nile. And he says, look, you can't do that. This is absolutely brutal Islamophobic act. You can't really mutilate the body. You can see this loyalty on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're being disturbed by the arrogance and the disrespect of the white British imperial elites. I'm gonna end this with a note is that this golden age of Britain as a Mohammedan power continued all the way to World War I. And in fact, Britain showed its legitimacy in the eyes of its Muslim subjects by recruiting 400,000 Muslim soldiers in the Indian army. No, this number is exaggerated. I don't know who wrote the 400,000. Yeah, but it may be close to. But these are the numbers somebody made the research. And this number is important in the sense that for various geopolitical reasons, the Ottoman Empire declared war on Britain and tried to use Islam against Britain, claiming that Muslims have to side with the Ottoman Empire against Britain. But in reality, Muslims did not. The Indian Muslims said that the war is about politics, it's not religious, and they will remain loyal to the British Empire. In fact, they were so loyal. These are the pictures of Indian Muslims in the British Army invading Palestine. And this is an interesting point in the sense that Britain felt so confident in its legitimacy in the eyes of the Muslims is that when the Ottomans had the kind of holy war against Britain, they countered it. And it seems like they were becoming more successful, right? They found the Emir of Mecca to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And someone actually noted that when during World War I, the current grandfather of the current king of Jordan, revolted against the Ottomans, which they were local rulers of that time, Britain felt so confident that now they created a clash within Islam, and the Arabs are moving to the side of the Britain. And Begum of Bhopal noted that, well, that's not a big deal because they're moving to a side where there are more Muslims if they are supported by the British. And there will be a lot of British-supported Arab monarchies after World War I to replace the Ottomans. But there's one issue, is that this legitimacy is very sensitive, because then Britain promised that Indian Muslims that the war is not about religion, they will respect holy spaces, holy sites. And then this happened, that in the Balfour Declaration, after Britain, around the time of Britain occupation of Palestine, there was a promise to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine where there was a Muslim majority. And I think this is a stark turning point in terms of this long period of a symbiotic relationship between the idea of a Muslim connectivity, Muslim empowerment, Muslim world, and the British imperial legitimacy, because this plan, which was then implemented with the mandate, is considered a violation of British promises to both Indian Muslims and Arab Muslims. And it was seen as ironic that the greatest Muslim empire in the world was promising a Muslim majority land to the Jewish world. And there were some sort of an anti-Semitic elements of why Britain was doing it, is because they thought that the Bolsheviks are Jewish. They were trying to get the Jews on their side or Bolsheviks on their side. But whatever the rationale, I think this is an interesting turning point where we can see that the imperial legitimacy of the Britain, relying on this kind of support for Muslims and their pilgrimage and their connectivity, was being shattered because of geopolitics, because or also Islamophobia and racism. I'm going to stop here, but before I stop, I want to go to my last slide. I want to get to that. We can discuss it. I found it fascinating is that when current queen had the Diamond Jubilee, she gave a lunch. I just found this by accident. Lunch for all the monarchs in the world. It's a great list. The Japanese emperor is there, but all the Muslim monarchs in that meeting, I counted them, and you might see with their headgear the Saudis and Qataris and the Malays and United Arab Emirates. And if you go back, Brunei, they're mostly the monarchs who were being supported by the British in one way or another in its history. So that kind of symbiotic relationship actually survived the decolonization and nationalism in various forms. I just wanted to leave that picture. So to conclude, for lessons for today, we can see that one empire, the greatest, most powerful empire of the 19th century, finds itself in a very unique position to contribute intellectually and in terms of technological infrastructure for the formation of a modern Muslim identity, for the pan-Islamic notion of the Muslim world. It has a lot to do with the British Empire. But at the same time, it contributes not only to infrastructure, but also by providing Muslims with a set of problems, a kind of a problem space. That is Islamophobia, racism, geopolitics of its relationship with the Ottoman Empire, and that fractures around World War I and leaves us the legacy that we still deal with today. And I think one invisible part is that modern Muslim thought has a lot to do with that period of dealing with British colonial rule intellectually, politically. Most of the founding figures of the modern Muslim thought are actually English-speaking subjects of the British Empire, right? That, or the people who had experienced that, from Sayyid Ahmed Khan to Muhammad Iqbal, and they are not, their British imperial experience is not insignificant. I think if we go back, we may see that there is a lot of empire and infrastructure even in the current debates on Islam and the West and Islam and politics. I will leave it here in an ambivalent way and hoping that we can unpack this during the question and discussions. Thank you.